Here we're going to be taking a look at another one of my commander decks. This one's Omnath, the Locust of Mana. Did a video on this a few years back, I think it was 2012. It's changed quite a bit since then, but the main idea is the same. Basically going to build up lots of mana, dump it into him, use it to either do lethal commander damage or to pop off some really big, really huge creatures and spells to finish off your opponents. And we'll get right in and take a look. So the first thing we have here is our mana base. It's a mono green deck. Went with snow-covered forests on here because we have cards in there like Extraplanar Lens that boost any land of the same name. The chances that your opponents are running these instead of regular forests is kind of slim, so it makes it so that card only benefits us instead of everyone. But our main base of these is a little bit different than the old one. We only have 29 now because we've gone with some other non-basic lands. For our first non-basic, we have Mosswort Bridge. Lets you bring in big creatures without having to pay their casting costs. You basically scry for one and then you exile it under the land. When you have power of 10 or greater, it lets you bring it in play for a single green. Really nice card for getting out some big creatures early on. With the deck, the way it's built, there's a lot of high power creatures, so it doesn't take long to get to that 10 power to be able to use it. Next we have Winding Canyons. This one only adds colorless, but for 2 mana you can tap it and it basically gives any of your creatures flash, which gives you the ability if Omnath is about to get killed and has a bunch of mana stored, you can use this to give him flash to resummon him before the mana pool dumps at the end of the phase. Next up we have Deserted Temple. This one taps for a colorless, but if you pay one and tap it, it lets you untap a target land. We have a lot of things in this deck that let our basic forests tap for multiple mana. Being able to pay one and tap this to untap one of those other forests, or something like the Shrine of Nyx, which is also in here, to get multiple mana definitely makes it worth it. Next we have Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. This one's just a great all-around land, especially in a monocolored deck when you can really build up a decent amount of devotion. Taps for a colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it. You choose a color and then you add mana equal to your devotion. It's a mono green deck with a lot of big stompy things, a lot of enchantments. You're really going to have a easy time building up a high devotion. So paying 2 to tap this, you're going to get more than that back. And last we have Rogue's Passage. It's kind of a utility land for this deck. It basically gives you the ability to make Omnath or one of your other big creatures unblockable. And with the theme of this deck, building up mana to store an Omnath, you can get them above 21, make them unblockable, and do lethal commander damage. For spells, I like to stick with things that are either reusable or permanent enchantments. I'm not a big fan and commander of instants and sorceries that can only be used once and then they're done. There are ways to reshuffle your graveyard. There's a couple in this deck even. But I just prefer to keep things that have a long-lasting utility use. Start off here, we have Death's Presence. It's a good one with all the big stompy creatures that we have access to in here. When one of the creatures dies, this lets you put +1/+1 counters on a target creature you control equal to the power of the creature that died. So when you can build up some of your creatures really high, or even Omnath, if he's got a lot of mana stored up, if he gets killed off, gives you multiple +1/+1 counters you can spread around. Hull of Gemstone is one of the newer additions to the deck. It gets a lot of hate at certain tables. Very effective against some other multicolored decks. Basically, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they have to choose a color, and all their lands only produce that color for the turn. While I'm playing a mono green deck, it does nothing to me, but anybody playing multicolor really has to pick and choose carefully and may limit what they can cast. Now, any creatures that tap for mana or artifacts or things like that still make colors, so it doesn't completely neuter them, but it definitely slows down some of the more powerful multicolored decks out there, at least early game. The Elixir of Immortality is pretty much a staple. It should be in every commander deck. For 2 mana, you tap it, you get 5 life, and then you shuffles it and then your entire graveyard back into your library, getting maybe some cards that have been used that you want back. You get a chance to get them again. its reusable life gain, which is also nice, and definitely a good addition to any deck, I think. Next up we have Doubling Cube. This is the first of many things in here that's made to ramp up the mana exponentially. This one costs you 3 mana and you tap it, but it doubles the mana currently in your pool. This combined with Omnath's ability to store mana means you can store a ridiculous amount of mana in your commander and then use this to double his power every turn. Basically, once you get this in play and you have enough mana to trigger it off, you can get your commander in play because it costs about the same to use, and you can just start ramping up from there to cast pretty much anything in the deck. Next we have our Extraplanar Lens. Talked about this when we were going through the lands. Extraplanar Lens lets you remove a land from the game and exile it, and you basically put it under there, and any land that has the same name as that now taps for double mana for the rest of the game, or, well, at least while Extraplanar Lens is in play. Really lets you ramp up the mana gain, letting all your lands tap for 2, and because we're using a snow-covered forests, the chances that your opponents have the same named lands in their deck are very slim, and it helps us and not them. Next we have Kage Son. It's another mana ramp card. This one, when it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. In this case, we're always going to pick green. Creatures of that chosen color that you control get +1/+1, which is nice. It boosts up all of your creatures, even the little small token guys. But the better part of it is, whenever an ability adds 1 or more mana of the chosen color, you add an extra one as well. So it's another one that's going to basically double our land's efficiency. Lightning Greaves is another staple card in Commander. If you're not running it, you're kind of silly. It gives you the Shroud and Haste, which is very nice. The one combination you do have to watch out for is having Shroud to, say, protect your commander is a nice thing. It also prevents you from targeting your commander for things like Rogue's Passage and Winding Canyons. So that's something to keep in mind. It does have a 0 equip cost though, so you can always move it off of him to use those abilities and then put it back. Helix Pinnacles, kind of a hit or miss. It's in there just as a secondary win condition for the deck. With the ability to generate so much mana, gives you another outlet to funnel all that mana in to do something productive. It's shrouded, so it can't be targeted, which makes it nice. It sticks around. Short of a board wipe, it's going to be there. Putting the counters on costs X mana for X amount of counters. If you get 100 counters at the beginning of your upkeep, you win. So you store up a lot of mana on the end of the opponent's turn before yours. You dump it all in there, you get your tokens, and you'll win on your upkeep. The Bow of No Leah, definitely a nice all-around card there. Giving all of your creatures that you are attacking with Death Touch. With a lot of the big, stompy, trampling creatures in this deck, Death Touch is just kind of like insult to injury with them. And definitely a nice ability to have. It also has that ability to let you add +1/+1 counters or deal damage to flying creatures, gaining life. It's got a lot of different uses. Next we have the Whisper Silk Cloak. It's another basic way to protect one of your big creatures. Makes them unblockable and have Shroud. You can put this on your commander to give him the ability to be unblockable to do that lethal damage. But again, as with the Lightning Greaves, it also makes him have Shroud, so you can't use any of your other abilities on him at the time. This one, I'm the only person I've ever seen actually run this in a commander deck, and I don't see why, because it's ridiculously good, especially with some of the cards that we have in play here. But Conjurus Closet, basically at the beginning of your end step, lets you bounce a creature and then put them back on the battlefield. So anything that you have that has a when it enters the battlefield condition, you can trigger every turn with this, which is amazingly powerful. It can also be used to bounce a creature that has any kind of negative enchantment or curse on it, and it removes all those. Definitely a bunch of different uses for it, but the big one is to bounce all those creatures that you have that have the enters the battlefield ability and trigger it multiple times. Next we have Swiftfoot Boots. It's kind of a second Lightning Greaves. Not quite as good. The nice one about this one is that it has hexproof instead of Shroud, which means you can still target your own creature. So it makes it a little bit better in that respect, although it does cost 1 to equip. But in a mana gain deck, you can have so much mana, it really doesn't matter. It's basically there to throw on one of your big creatures to either protect them or to give them that haste. Next we have the Sword of Vengeance. It's the only sword in this deck, but it just adds so much, especially to some of our bigger creatures. The +2/+0 is really the least of it. It's the first strike, vigilance, trample, and haste. You can give that to one of your monster creatures or one of the hydras when you first cast it and come out swinging with it unexpectedly. Having vigilance means they're not going to tap, so you can still have that creature around for defense as well. So it's just an all-around good card. Rancor is kind of an oddball one. It's in here just because there are a handful of the larger creatures that don't have trample. It's another way to give them trample. I really put it in here because it's reusable. I like the fact that if anything should happen to the creature, it goes back to your hand, you can play it again later. So it's definitely the reusability is really the reason this one's in here, but also that ability to give just about anything that you want trample. The one real weakness of this deck is its defense against flying. Gravity Wells here is one of our few defenses that we do have. Usually you can beat on people hard enough where they end up blocking with their flyers and you kill them with your big creatures anyway. But in case something happens, it's always nice to have a backup plan. Basically makes any creature with flying lose flying when they attack. So any of our creatures in the deck can block them at that point. Predator's Flagship is another one of our anti-flying things. It also gives you the ability to fly over enemy defenders if you need be. You can give a target creature flying, and you can also destroy a target creature with flying. Now the interesting combo with those is if you have enough mana, you can obviously use the one ability, give an enemy creature flying, use the second ability and destroy that creature. And you have plenty of mana in this deck to trigger that off, so it comes in handy multiple times per game once you get it in play. Bernal Booms, another one of our massive mana ramp cards. Whenever a forest is tapped for mana, it produces an additional green mana. Now this affects everyone, but the nice thing is because it's affecting everyone, anybody else playing green is more likely not going to try to destroy this one. If they have any kind of remove enchantment spells or whatever, chances are this one's going to stick around and it's going to help you probably more than them just because of the way the deck's built. Next we have Retreat to Ken Kazan. I never say that right. This one's a newer addition to the deck. Kind of plays in with a lot of the other things. It's one that's on the verge of the chopping block if I find something better. I know there's a lot of cards I want to add, but it still has its uses. Basically, every time a land enters the battlefield under your control, you can either gain some life or put a +1/+1 counter on creatures. Always nice to have more +1/+1 counters. You've got tons of land in this deck that are going to be hitting the battlefield, so if you get it out early, it's really useful. And it's always nice to have another way in there to gain life. Not a great card, but like I said, it's definitely a filler one for now. Next up we have Asceticism. This is actually one of my favorite ones. Creatures you control can't be target of spells or abilities that your opponents control. Basically it gives all of your creatures in play hexproof, which is really nice. And it has the ability for 2 mana you can give a target creature regen. Genesis Wave is one that it's kind of hit or miss in here. It's amazingly powerful if you can get it to trigger in the right circumstances. But at the same time, I used to run a ton of X-casting creatures in here, and I've cut back on those a lot because of this card, because I've gotten shafted by it multiple times. But it lets you basically dump a ton of mana into it, go through your deck, and just cast a ridiculous amount of creatures in one turn. In the right circumstances, it pretty much ends the game. Green Sun Zenith is an amazing card. If you're playing green in a deck and you're not running this card, you're pretty much doing something wrong. It basically is a tutor, lets you go get any creature you want out of your deck with a set casting cost, and it gets reshuffled into your library every time you cast it, so it's reusable multiple times. It's a stupidly good card for what it does, and it's like a must-have in a green deck. Next we have Mana Reflection, another way to increase our mana. If you tap a permanent for mana, it produces twice as much of that mana instead. The thing that I really love about this is it's any permanent, so any of those creatures that you have or anything like that, artifacts that generate mana, this will actually double the amount that you get from those as well, which makes some of our mana gaining artifacts and things in this deck ridiculously powerful. Next we have Primeval Bounty. This one's kind of a hit or miss. It's a little expensive. If you draw it early on, it can hurt you more than anything else because it's just tying up your hand. But if you draw it mid-game or so, once you've got a little bit of mana built up, it's definitely a great card. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you get yourself a beast token, 3/3 beast token. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you're getting a +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures, and whenever you play a land, you're gaining life. So no matter what you're playing each turn, you're gaining something off of it, which definitely counterbalances its cost in the long run. Next we have Quest for Renewal. It's another interesting one. I kind of run it just for my sake. It's something I've always had fun playing with. And whenever a creature you control becomes tapped, you put a counter on there. And that's tapped for any reason. If you're attacking with them, if somebody plays a card on you that makes you tap a creature, if you tap it for an ability, any reason it becomes tapped, you get the counter for that. Once there's 4 counters on there, you untap your creatures during every other player's untap step, which comes into play with some of our mana generating creatures. We can tap them on our turn, untap them on the next player's turn, tap them on their turn, untap them on the next player's turn, and so on. And last for our spell cards, we have Up Wildspeaker here. Kinda not a big fan of Planeswalkers in Commander. They usually get targeted and wiped out quickly. They usually don't last very long. His +1 ability is nice that it lets you untap 2 target lands. You can use it to untap the Forest when they're tapping for multiple mana. You can use it to untap Shrine of Nyx to get ridiculous amounts of mana generated in a single turn. So it has several uses for there. The second ability, the -1 to put the 3/3 Beast token, isn't that great. The real reason he's in the deck is for his -4 ability that lets us basically have Overrun at any time, giving you that +3/+3 to all your creatures and giving them all trample. I had a different version of Garruk in here for a while, the one that gave you, essentially gives you the token that lets you, whenever you cast a creature, go look for another creature. And he was a really powerful guy in the deck, but again, he never got high enough to ever trigger that minus ability. So this one's another one that may get cut, depending on if I can get better cards to replace him. So on to our creatures. I basically have the creatures in this deck broke down into a couple different categories. You have your big stompy creatures, which are there to do damage. You have your utility creatures, which are there for their special effects and enter the battlefield effects that can be used with Conjurus Closet and things like that. And then you have your mana gaining creatures. First off, we're going to start with the Hydra Broodmaster. One of my favorite Hydras. It's already a beast at a 7/7. You can do the monstrous ability and make it into just something gigantic. And it spits out a bunch of little Hydras at the same time. So definitely a nice one there. Also not an XX casting cost, so he doesn't come out as a 0/0, and if things like Genesis Wave bring him into the battlefield. Next we have a Protean Hydra. He's basically there for early game. Late game you can put him out and be absolutely disgusting with him. Early game you can put him out and still have a decent creature to start with. Nice thing is he can soap up a lot of those little 1 ping, 2 ping damages and boost himself up and make himself stronger, which is really kind of interesting. But definitely he's a card that can be used any game, or at any point during a game. Next we have the Colony Hydra. This is one of my favorites. It's really underused. The 8 casting cost for an 8/8 trample. Some people look at it and kind of shun it. But it has this really neat, basically devotion ability that for every green mana symbol on the permanents you control, it costs 1 less to cast. In a deck where a lot of your powerful cards have 2 green mana symbols per card, you're going to have several on the board at any given time, and basically he ends up costing free most of the time. Next we have the Oran Reef Hydra. You can tell I really like my Hydras. I think the whole top quarter here is all Hydras. But 5/5 with trample. Has a landfall ability that gives them +1/+1 tokens, which is really nice. And if they're forced, you get 2 +1/+1 tokens instead. Playing a mono green deck where there's only like 6, I think, 5 or 6 lands in the entire deck that aren't forests, he builds up to a disgusting number very quickly. Next we have a Hydra Omnivore. This one will draw you a lot of hate in a multiplayer game, but it's a really fun one. He's just an 8/8, doesn't have trample, but if you attack a player and deal damage to the opponent, it also deals damage, that same amount of damage to all the other opponents at the table. So you can pick on the guy who has no defenders or use something to make him unblockable. There's lots of different combos there. Any kind of trample. If he hits a player, everybody else at the table is also going to take that amount of damage. So It's an interesting creature, but he does draw a lot of attention. Next we have the Nessun Wildsravager. It's another really nice Hydra. It's another one of my favorite ones. This one starts out as a 6/6, but he has a Tribute Sex ability. And basically, your opponent has to choose whether to pay the tribute and let him come out as a 12/12, or he gets to pick one of the opponent's creatures and deal damage to them and take damage from that creature, vice versa. So otherwise, you're either getting a 12/12 or you're getting a 6/6, and you're going to pick one of their weaker creatures to kill them off right on the summoning. It's kind of a neat ability. Next up, we have a Primordial Hydra. It's one of the X-casting 0/0 ones, which kind of gets screwed over on Genesis Wave, but he's just too good not to include. He has a XX, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you double the number of counters on him. And as soon as he gets to 10 or more counters, he also gains trample. So early game, you can cast him really weak, and he starts doubling each turn. Late game, you can make him absolutely disgusting right off the bat, and he doubles each turn after that. So it's just a really good all-around card. Next we have Palaka Worm. Yeah, I can never say his name right. So the World Eater. He's a starts out as a 5/5, pretty beastly little guy. Has a monstrous ability that is XX, so you basically can boost him up to whatever, depending on how much mana you have at the time. And when you do that, he also deals damage divided as you want to any number of creatures your opponent controls, and then he takes damage back from them, same as the other Hydra there, but it happens when he becomes monstrous, so if you wait till later in the game and you dump a ton of mana into it, he can basically wipe out everybody's creatures, and he can take the damage. Even if it kills them off, you've cleared the board. It's kind of gross. Next we have the first of our mana generating cards, Seedborn Muse. Anybody running green probably knows what this card is. It lets you untap all your permanents on each other player's untap phase. Comes into play with all those mana doubling cards we have for our lands. We can untap all of our lands multiple times on, once for each player's turn as we go around. And it just starts sick combos where you can tap them every turn, untap them on the next player's turn, tap them again, and store all that mana in Omnath for ridiculous amounts. Next we have Vorinclex, Voice of Hunger. It's another really good mana card, but this one also draws a lot of hatred at the table. You put this one on the table and you're going to be a target until he's gone in the very least. It's a 7/6 trample that basically lets any of your lands tap for double the amount of mana, and all of your opponent's lands don't untap the turn after they tap them. So basically their lands only untap every other turn, and it really slows everybody else down while boosting you up. Next we have Patron of Roshi. This is a weird addition to the deck until you actually see what it can do. It has a snake offering ability that makes him cost less for snakes. I don't even think there are any in this deck. Never use that ability on him anyway. It's the bottom ability here to let you untap all forests and all green creatures. The ability can only be used once per turn. Comes into play with Seedborn Muse, and then again all of our mana tapping lands. You can tap all your lands, tap all your creatures that generate mana, tap him, untap everything, tap everything again. Seedborn Muse at the beginning of your opponent's turn untaps everything again, and so on. It's a really disgusting combo once it gets into play. Next we have Oracle of Meldiah. It's another way to get you more mana faster. You play with the top card of your library revealed. If it's a land, you can play it off your deck. It also lets you play up to 2 lands a turn, and just let you get more lands out there quicker. Not so sure if this one's going to stay in there. There isn't enough things in this deck that let you go fetch lands to have a bunch in your hand to make use of that, being able to play 2 a turn. But it is a nice addition for now. I'm not so sure I like the opponents knowing when I'm going to draw every turn too, so that's one of the reasons it may get cut. Next we have Karametra's Alkalite. This one is another mana ramp card. Taps for your devotion to green. Again, with all the high casting cost cards in here that have double green, triple green on some of them, you're going to have a lot of green symbols out there to make use of. Next we have Tornado Elemental. This one's more recent addition to the deck, but I really like its utility here. When it comes into play, it deals 6 damage to each creature with flying. There's no flying creatures in this deck, so it doesn't really hurt me at all. We have things like the airship that I can give an opponent flying, put this in play, deal 6 damage to him. The real nice thing is it's an enter the battlefield ability. So combined with Conjurus Closet, you can bounce this and trigger that every turn if you want. Also during combat, it lets you assign its damage as though it weren't blocked. So it has a nice ability there as well. Next we have a Palaka Worm. This one's kind of another utility. Stompy creature, 7/7 trample. Has a nice ability when it enters the battlefield you gain 7 life. And if it's put into the graveyard you get to draw a card. Combines well again with the Conjurus Closet, bouncing that to gain that 7 life multiple times. Next up we have Avenger of Zendikar, and I love the alternate artwork on the foil one here. It's from one of the decks, I believe. When he comes into play, you get a bunch of 0/1 plant tokens equal to the number of lands you control, and then every time you play a land after, you get a +1/+1 counter on all those plant creatures. Let you build them up, kind of fun. And again, he can be used with Conjurus Closet to bounce in multiple of those plant tokens ridiculously fast. I think this whole section here is things that I made to add it in here to use with Conjurus Closet. But this one's the Wood Elves. Kind of out of place. They're the only thing in here that's so weak as far as their stats go. They're in here because when they enter the battlefield, you get to go get a forest and put it into play, and it's not even tapped like most of the cards do. You get to put it into play untapped. And with all those mana doubling cards, again, being able to play extra lands, and this one even lets you go fetch them, combined with Conjurus Closet where you can bounce this and go fetch land every turn and put it into play untapped, becomes really powerful really quickly. Next we have Eternal Witness. Another weak creature, but the ability is well worth it. It's an enter the battlefield ability, so you can trigger it multiple times using things like Conjurus Closet again. Like I said, I love that card. Lets you bring any card back from your graveyard to your hand. Can use it to get pretty much whatever you want back out of there if you happen to lose a piece to one of the combos or something you really wanted to play and didn't get a chance to. This is another one that may be on the chopping block. Not quite as good as the Wood Elves. Does the same ability when it enters the battlefield. You can go get a land. Does come into play tapped with this one. But again, Conjurus Closet lets you do it multiple times. It's definitely something that may be replaced once I find something better. Acidic Slime, pretty much a staple in any kind of deck. Lets you destroy a target artifact, enchantment, or land when it comes into play. 2/2 with Death Touch is not much to fear, but I have a lot of ways to boost it up, make it stronger. It's really here for that enter the battlefield ability, which can be used in conjunction, again, with Conjurus Closet to really put a hurting on people. Next we have the Terestodon. So this one's kind of a more utility-based. It lets you destroy a target non-creature permanent, up to 3. And then for each one that are destroyed, the controller of those gets a 3/3 green elephant. You can use it to destroy some enchantments or things that are really helping an enemy or hurting you if they have some curses or things like that on you. It can also be used to just get rid of some really annoying board control type cards. You're giving them a 3/3, but at the same time you're getting a 9/9 out of it, so it's not so bad. Basically gives you a little bit of control though, and lets you pick and choose what you want to use it on. It does say up to 3, so you don't even have to use one if you want. So the ability is completely optional. And as again with the whole stack here, works with Conjurus Closet, you can run it multiple times to really wipe out some really annoying combos that your opponents may have in play. Next we have No Leah, God of the Hunt. This one's kind of cool. It's one of those enchantment creatures. It's also a god card, which is nice. It's indestructible, comes into play and gives all your other creatures trample, which is very nice. Once your devotion gets to 5, which doesn't take much in this deck, becomes a creature as well. And also has that ability on there to give other creatures +2/+2 till end of turn. Very nice, multiple uses. Giving everybody trample is worth it all in the end. The other abilities are just icing on the cake. Next we have Spearbreaker Behemoth. Not the greatest creature in its own. It's a little overcosted for a 5/5 creature with only indestructible. It's that second ability that lets you pay 1 to give another creature with power 5 or greater, make them indestructible this turn. It's basically protection for your other creatures and your commander once they get built up. Next we have Predator Ooze. This is another one of our small creatures that's good at any point in the game and then builds up quickly. It's indestructible, which is really nice, so I basically use it a lot of times as a blocker. Whenever it attacks, it gets a +1/+1 counter. Whenever it deals damage to a creature and that creature goes to the graveyard, it gets a +1/+1 counter. Then it starts building up exponentially. Early on, basically, though, it's just a blocker that's indestructible. Next we have Rampaging Baloth. They're another utility card. 6/6 trample isn't anything to be shy about, but at the same time, that ability to put the 4/4 beast into play every time you play a land really builds up nicely and gives you those smaller expendable creatures that you can use for various things. Next we have Soul of the Harvest. This one's an interesting one. 6/6 trample. Nice thing about it is other non-token creatures, when they enter the battlefield under your control, you can draw a card. This comes into play really nicely with all those cards that we had previously that can be bounced using the Conjurus Closet and get all of their abilities. They also entering the battlefield, so you get to draw a card again, which is a very nice combo with them. Next we have Silklash Spider. This one's another one of our anti-flyer cards in here. Like I said, the big weakness of this deck is flying, and there's several cards in here to try to compensate for that. This is one of them. It's a 2/7 reach. Nothing spectacular. That second ability, though, with the X green lets you deal X damage to a creature with flying, and it's reusable. Doesn't require a tap, so you can basically burn off a ton of mana and just wipe out the skies with them, which is nice. Next we have Thunderfoot Baloth. He's a newer addition to the deck. This is a 5/5 trample, but I really like the secondary ability, which is made specifically for Commander, which is he's a lieutenant. As long as your commander's on the battlefield, he gets +2/+2, and all your other creatures get +2/+2 and trample. Again, it's another way to give every creature in the deck trample, which is nice, and that +2/+2 to boot. Next we have a Fierce Empath. He's in here, basically it's a utility card. Lets you go fetch a creature with a converted mana cost of 6 or more, which most of our creatures are. And again, it's an enter the battlefield ability, so it can be used multiple times with Conjurus Closet. Again, I can't say how much I love that card. Being able to go fetch the creature you want is always a good thing. Next we have the Artisan of Kozilek. I try to stay away from the Eldrazi cards in this deck because some of them are just, at least the older ones, the newer ones aren't as bad. But the old ones were just stupidly powerful, and I have a deck specifically for them, not for Commander, but I try to avoid them. This one's only in here basically because he has the ability when he enters the battlefield, it lets you return a creature from your graveyard directly to the battlefield without paying a casting cost, which is ridiculously powerful. And again, he has that Annihilator 2 ability, which is nice. High casting cost, decent powered card though. Next up we have a Siege Behemoth. It's got Hexproof, 7/4, not a super powerful creature, but as long as he is attacking, each other creature you control can have that creature assign its combat damage as though it weren't blocked. So even if you're going to sacrifice him during the attack, you can put out him with a bunch of your other creatures, attack with him, and all your other creatures do their damage, and usually you can wipe out an entire player doing that. Next we have Gaia's Revenge. This one's kind of an entertaining one. Nothing spectacularly powerful about it. It's an 8/5, but it has the ability that it can't be countered. He has haste, and he can't be the target of non-green spells from non-green sources. So it really protects him from a lot of things right out the get-go. It's an 8/5 with haste, which is kind of nice. You combine it with things like Winding Canyons to play it with Flash, and you have an 8/5 with haste that they didn't even see coming. You can throw it out there during combat using that combo and make it really disgusting. Next we have a Dungrove Elder. It's a hexproof. He gets a power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control. You're going to be putting out a lot of lands, building up quickly. He starts out a little small if you get him early game, but builds up pretty quickly, and that hexproof ability keeps him around for a while. Next we have the Worldspine Worm. I've contemplated cutting this card so many times because of its ridiculous mana cost. But at the same time, this deck generates so much mana that it doesn't take long before you can put him into play. And it's just such a fun card to play. The 15/15 trample is bad enough, but then when he dies, you get the 3/5/5 worms with trample. Really a disgusting thing, and when he goes to the graveyard, it gets shuffled back into the library so you can draw him again later. It is ridiculously expensive. If you draw it early game, it's a dead card for a long time. But anything from mid-game on, it becomes a really fun, really powerful creature. Next we have Forgotten Ancient. This one kind of gets overlooked because of its mediocre stats for its casting cost. It costs you 4 mana to cast, you get a 0/3. But every time a player casts a spell, you can put a +1/+1 counter on them. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you can move those counters to any other creature. In a multiplayer game, where everybody might be playing 1-2 spells per person per round, you got 3 people going before it's your turn again, and each one of them casts 2 spells. He becomes a 6/9 on the first round you cast him, you know, in effectiveness. And then those tokens can be moved to other things. He often gets overlooked, and he builds up to really stupid, powerful numbers really quickly before anybody even pays attention to him. Next up, we have the Giant Ataphage. This one is kind of iffy. It has its problems, but I do like it. It just ends up being really fun to play. The high casting cost for a 7/7 trample, but it's on par with some others. The real nice thing is that if he deals combat damage to a player, which you can with that trample, then you get a copy of him. And then the copies also have the same ability, so next time you'll have 2 of them attacking, and if they do damage, they double again, and so on, and before you know it, you have an entire army of these things. Next we have Primal Crux. This one's an interesting card. Basically has the ability of a devotion before they had devotion. It's called Chroma in this, whereas power and toughness are equal to the number of green mana symbols that you control. He costs 6 green to start with, so he starts at a minimum of a 6/6 with trample. The real nice combo is something like him. You put him into play, and then you immediately cast the Colony Hydra. And because he costs 6, he costs less to cast per every one that's out there. So you only end up paying 2 for the Colony Hydra. And then you've got 8 from him, 6 from him. You get a 14/14 creature for 8 mana. Becomes really disgusting really quickly. And he only goes worse from there depending on what other green permanents you have in play. Next we have a Scavenging Ooze. Pretty much everybody knows what these are by now. It's only a measly little 2/2. But for 1 mana, you can exile a target card from a graveyard, and if it's a creature card, he gets a +1/+1, and you gain a life. Really useful for wiping out opponents' graveyards, especially in a mana deck like this, where you can dump stupid amounts of mana into this and just wipe out everybody's graveyard. No fear of them bringing things back from the graveyard, and it makes him stronger to boot. Next we have a Scoot Mob. Another tiny little creature that builds up pretty quickly. This one's a 1 mana cost for a 1/1, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 5 or more lands, you put 4 +1/+1 counters on them. So once you get those 5 lands in play, which aren't very hard, he's going to be adding +4/+4 every turn, and it adds up really quickly. And he's not even that bad of a creature right off the get-go, so very nice thing to have. Lastly, we have Malamo the Morrow Sorcerer. He's basically another Dungrove Elder. He's got trample, and his power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. You're going to have lands in a green deck. He's going to get stupidly big really quickly. Well, that's it for a current Omnath the Locust mana deck. Let me know in the comments what you think. Things you might want to add. I have a couple cards that I want to add I just don't own right now, so kind of iffy on them. If you look at my tapped out deck list, which I'll link down in the comments, you can see the cards that I'm looking at to put in there. The ones I want, the ones that I gotta buy still, and things like that. Yeah, let me know what you think, and we'll see you in the next video.